The photograph is small, no larger than a playing card. Its silver surface has darkened with age, the way all daguerreotypes do, surrendering their clarity to the slow chemistry of time. But this one is different. It was taken on the morning of September the 14th, 1858, in the village of Harrowden Marsh, Suffolk, England, a place that no longer exists on any modern map. The image shows two children, girls, identical twins, approximately 9 years of age. They are seated on a wooden bench in what appears to be a modest photographic studio. Their dresses are white. Their hair is parted in the center and drawn back tightly. Their hands rest in their laps, fingers interlaced, as was the custom for long exposure sittings. Their faces are calm, almost serene. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about this image. It is one of thousands of such portraits produced in that era. Stiff, formal, unremarkable. But look closer. Look at their eyes. The twin on the left is gazing directly into the lens. This is expected. This is normal. The twin on the right, however, is not looking at the camera. She is looking at something behind the photographer. Something above and to the left, at an angle that suggests considerable height. Her chin is tilted upward by roughly 15 degrees. Her pupils, even in the faded silver of the plate, appear dilated to an extent that is physiologically inconsistent with the amount of light required for a daguerreotype exposure. And there is one more detail, one that was not noticed until 1971, when the plate was examined under magnification at the Ipswich County Archive. The twin on the right has no reflection in her own eyes. The twin on the left does. You can see the faint, inverted shape of the camera apparatus, the window, the outline of the photographer. This is normal. This is how light works. But the right twin's eyes, despite being open, despite being clearly in focus, reflect nothing. They are dark, completely dark, as if she were sitting in a room that did not exist. This is the only known photograph of the Caldwell twins. It was taken approximately 4 hours before they disappeared. To understand what happened in Harrowden Marsh, you must first understand the world in which it happened. 1858 was a year of unease. In London, the Great Stink had rendered the Thames nearly uninhabitable. The smell of raw sewage permeated Parliament itself, and sheets soaked in chloride of lime hung in the windows of Westminster to keep legislators from fainting. Cholera was still poorly understood. The germ theory of disease would not gain acceptance for another decade. Physicians still spoke of miasma, of bad air, of corrupted atmospheres that could warp the body and derange the mind. In the countryside, the anxieties were different, but no less potent. The railway had begun to reach into the smaller villages of East Anglia, and with it came strangers, commerce, and a creeping sense that the old rhythms of life were being dismantled. Harrowden Marsh was a village of perhaps 300 souls, situated on low, boggy ground near the River Deepens. The air there smelled of peat and standing water, and the faintly sulphurous tang of decomposing marsh grass. In autumn, the fog would settle so thickly that lanterns were required at midday. It was an isolated place, a damp place, a place where sound traveled strangely across the flat, wet land. Photography, in 1858, was still a relatively young science. The daguerreotype process, invented less than 20 years earlier, required the subject to remain perfectly still for exposure times ranging from 15 seconds to over a minute, depending on the light. This is why so many early photographs show people with rigid postures and blank expressions. They were not stoic. They were simply trying not to move. The chemicals involved were dangerous. Mercury vapor was used in the development process. Bromine and chlorine were used to sensitize the plates. Photographers often suffered from tremors, respiratory illness, and in some cases, neurological deterioration. The photographer who took the Caldwell portrait was a man named Mr. Edwin Sable, an itinerant daguerreotypist who traveled the Suffolk countryside with a portable studio mounted on a cart. He had been practicing his trade for 6 years. His hands, according to a letter written by the local apothecary, Mr. Josiah Pemberton, already showed a fine, persistent tremor consistent with chronic mercury exposure. This detail will become important later. Victorian medicine, it must be said, existed in a state of confident ignorance. Doctors bled patients. They prescribed arsenic for skin conditions and strychnine for fatigue. The nervous system was understood only in the broadest terms. The word neurology would not enter common medical usage for another decade. When confronted with symptoms they could not explain, physicians reached for terms like hysteria, cerebral excitement, or sympathetic derangement of the vital organs. These were not explanations. They were elegant ways of saying, "We do not know." The Caldwell twins were named Eleanor and Clara. They were born on the 11th of March, 1849, to Mr. Thomas Caldwell, a tenant farmer, and his wife, Mrs. Anne Caldwell, née Whitmore. By all accounts, the Caldwells were a quiet, respectable family. Thomas worked a modest parcel of land on the eastern edge of the marsh. Anne kept the household and was known in the village for her skill with herbal remedies, a common enough practice in rural communities where the nearest physician was a half-day's ride away. The twins were, by every measure, normal children. Eleanor, the elder by 7 minutes, was described as the more outgoing of the two. She was the one who spoke first, who reached for things, who asked questions of strangers. The parish schoolmaster, a Mr. Clement Hargrave, noted in his attendance records that Eleanor was quick with arithmetic and possessed an unusually retentive memory. Clara was quieter. Not shy, precisely, but watchful. She had a habit of standing very still and observing things for long periods. A bird on a fence post, the movement of clouds, the behavior of other children at play, as though she were cataloging the world rather than participating in it. This was considered unremarkable. Many children are quiet. What was particular about the Caldwell twins, the detail that everyone who knew them mentioned, was their closeness. They did not merely finish each other's sentences, as twins sometimes do. They appeared, at times, to communicate without speaking at all. Mrs. Caldwell reportedly told a neighbor, a Mrs. Prudence Blackwood, that the girls would sometimes sit across from each other at the kitchen table and simply look at one another for 10 or 15 minutes without uttering a word, and then rise simultaneously and go about separate tasks as though instructions had been given and received. Mrs. Blackwood found this charming. Others in the village found it unsettling. In the summer of 1858, the twins turned 9. They were healthy. They attended school. They helped their mother in the garden and their father in the fields. Eleanor had recently begun learning to read from a battered copy of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Clara had taken an interest in drawing, filling the margins of her father's almanac with small, meticulous sketches of insects and plants. There was no illness, no trauma, no warning. The first anomaly was observed on the 29th of August, 1858, 16 days before the photograph was taken. It was a Sunday. The family had attended morning services at St. Cuthbert's, the small Norman church that served Harrowden Marsh and the surrounding hamlets. The vicar was Father Aldous Crane, a man of 62, educated at Cambridge, known for his methodical temperament and his detailed parish journals. It is from Father Crane's journals that we have the most meticulous documented account of what began to happen. During the sermon, Father Crane noticed that Clara Caldwell, seated between her mother and her sister in the third pew, had begun to weep. This was not in itself unusual. Children cry in church. But Father Crane noted and underlined the observation twice, that Clara was weeping without any change in her facial expression. Her face was perfectly still. Her eyes were open. Tears were streaming down both cheeks in continuous, unbroken lines, soaking the collar of her dress. But she was not blinking, and she did not appear to be in distress. Father Crane wrote, and I will quote his words exactly as they appear in the journal, now held in the Suffolk Records Office. "The child wept, as a stone statue weeps in the rain. The tears came, but the child was not there behind them. I felt a coldness in my chest that I cannot attribute to the draft." After the service, Father Crane approached Mrs. Caldwell and inquired about Clara's health. Mrs. Caldwell appeared confused. She said Clara had not been crying. She had been sitting beside the child the entire time and had noticed nothing. Father Crane did not press the matter, but he wrote about it that evening, in detail. 3 days later, on the 1st of September, the village physician, Dr. Horace Fenwick, was summoned to the Caldwell farm. Dr. Fenwick was a practical man. He had trained at Guy's Hospital in London and had served briefly as a military surgeon during the Crimean War before retiring to the Suffolk countryside. He was not given to superstition. Mrs. Caldwell had called for him because Eleanor had not slept in 2 days. Not merely that she had difficulty sleeping. She had not slept at all. She had remained awake, alert, and conversational for 48 consecutive hours without any apparent fatigue. Her eyes were clear. Her appetite was normal. Her temperature, measured by Dr. Fenwick with a mercury thermometer, was 97.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Her pulse was 52 beats per minute. 52. Dr. Fenwick noted this figure with evident surprise. A resting pulse of 52 in a 9-year-old child is abnormally low. The expected range would be between 70 and 110. A pulse of 52 would be more consistent with a trained adult athlete, or, as Dr. Fenwick wrote with clinical detachment, a body in the early stages of preparing itself for hibernation. He prescribed a mild tincture of valerian and suggested the child be kept in a darkened room. Eleanor slept that night, but Clara did not. And when Clara's sleeplessness began, Eleanor's resumed. They alternated. Perfectly, as though they were taking shifts. Over the next 12 days, the situation in the Caldwell household deteriorated in ways that were meticulously documented by 3 independent observers: Dr. Fenwick, Father Crane, and the schoolmaster, Mr. Hargrave. On September the 4th, Mr. Hargrave reported that Eleanor had answered a question in class before he had finished asking it. This might be dismissed as coincidence, except that the question concerned a passage from a text that had not yet been distributed to the students. Hargrave had only just received the book that morning by post. He had told no one its contents. Eleanor recited the passage word for word. When asked how she knew it, she said simply, "Clara told me." Clara had not been in school that day. She was at home, 700 yards away, in a room with no windows facing the school. On September the 6th, Dr. Fenwick conducted a more thorough examination of both twins. His notes from this visit survive in a leather-bound casebook that was donated to the Royal College of Physicians in 1912 and subsequently transferred to restricted archives in 1947. The reason for the restriction has never been publicly stated. What we know from transcriptions made before the restriction is this. Dr. Fenwick measured the twins' pulses simultaneously, one wrist in each hand. He recorded that their heartbeats were perfectly synchronized, not merely similar in rate, but identical in rhythm, beat for beat, with no detectable variance over a 5-minute observation period. He then separated the children into different rooms and repeated the measurement with the assistance of Mrs. Caldwell, who held a watch to Clara's pulse while Fenwick monitored Eleanor's. The synchronization persisted, he noted, with what reads as genuine alarm, that when he pricked Eleanor's finger with a lancet to draw a small blood sample, Clara, in the next room, with the door closed, cried out at the exact same moment, and a drop of blood appeared on Clara's corresponding finger. There was no wound. Dr. Fenwick examined Clara's hand under a magnifying lens. The skin was unbroken, but blood had emerged from the pore itself, as though the capillaries beneath had simply decided to open. He used the term spontaneous diapedesis, a medical phrase referring to the passage of blood cells through intact vessel walls. It is a real phenomenon, observed in cases of extreme inflammation. But it doesn't occur in healthy tissue. It doesn't occur in response to a stimulus applied to another person's body. It does not occur at all under these circumstances, and yet it was documented, witnessed, recorded in ink that has not faded in over 160 years. On September the 9th, Father Crane visited the Caldwell home at the request of Thomas Caldwell, who had become deeply frightened. The priest recorded that upon entering the kitchen, he found both twins seated at the table, facing each other, motionless. Their eyes were open, but appeared to be focused on a point approximately 6 inches in front of their faces, as though they were both examining something suspended in the air between them, something that was not there. Father Crane spoke to them. They did not respond. He touched Eleanor's shoulder. She was cold. Not cool, as one might expect from sitting still in a drafty farmhouse. Cold. He estimated her skin temperature to be comparable to that of a body that had been deceased for several hours. And yet her pulse, when he pressed his fingers to her neck, was present. Steady. 52 beats per minute. He attempted to move Clara's hand. It would not move, not because the child resisted, but because her arm had become rigid, locked in position with a force that Father Crane described as being like trying to bend an iron bar. He was a large man. He used both hands. The child's arm did not yield. This state lasted for approximately 40 minutes. Then, simultaneously, both children blinked, looked around the room as though they had just arrived, and asked for supper. They had no memory of the preceding hour. On September the 11th, 3 days before the photograph, Dr. Fenwick brought a colleague to examine the twins. This was Dr. Lucian Ashgrove, a specialist in disorders of the nervous system from the Bethlem Royal Hospital in London. Dr. Ashgrove had traveled to Suffolk specifically at Fenwick's urgent written request. Dr. Ashgrove conducted a series of tests over the course of 6 hours. He documented everything. His sworn testimony, given later to a magistrate's inquest, runs to 14 handwritten pages. Among his findings, the twins' pupils dilated and contracted in perfect unison, even when only one child was exposed to a change in light. When one twin was asked to hold her breath, the other twin's respiration ceased simultaneously, without instruction, without awareness. When a tuning fork was struck and held near Eleanor's left ear, Clara, seated in a closed room on the opposite side of the house, reported hearing a tone. She identified the correct pitch. And most inexplicably, when Dr. Ashgrove placed a sealed envelope containing a written word on the table in front of Eleanor, Clara, without seeing the envelope, without being told of its existence, spoke the word aloud. The word was threshold. Dr. Ashgrove wrote in his testimony, "I have attended patients in states of mania, of catalepsy, of every known derangement of the cerebral faculties. I have never encountered anything that I could not, with effort, attribute to a natural cause. I cannot attribute what I have witnessed in these children to any natural cause. I do not say it is supernatural. I say only that it is outside the boundaries of every physiological principle I have been taught, and I have been taught them all." On the morning of September the 14th, 1858, Mr. Edwin Sable arrived in Harrowden Marsh with his photographic cart. He had been engaged by Dr. Fenwick to produce a daguerreotype of the twins as part of the medical documentation. This was not uncommon. Photography was increasingly used in clinical settings to record unusual cases. Though the practice was still in its infancy, the sitting took place in the front room of the Caldwell farmhouse, which had been prepared with a white sheet hung against the wall and a bench positioned near the window for natural light. Sable set up his camera. He prepared the silver plate. He mixed his chemicals. The twins were brought in and seated. What happened during the exposure was witnessed by 5 people: Sable, Dr. Fenwick, Dr. Ashgrove, Father Crane, and Mrs. Caldwell. The exposure time was approximately 25 seconds. During those 25 seconds, according to all 5 witnesses, the temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that their breath became visible. Dr. Fenwick, who was holding a thermometer as part of his ongoing observations, recorded a decline from 61 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit in under 15 seconds. The candle on the mantelpiece went out, not as though extinguished by a draft. The flame, according to Father Crane, turned blue, then white, then simply ceased to exist, leaving the wick cold to the touch. Sable completed the exposure. He later said that his hands were shaking so badly from the cold, or from something else, that he nearly dropped the plate. When the image was developed, it showed what I described at the beginning of this account. 2 children, one looking at the camera, one looking at something else, one with reflections in her eyes, one without. But there was an additional detail that Sable noticed during the development process, one that he reportedly refused to discuss for the remainder of his life. On the wall behind the twins, the white sheet that had been hung as a backdrop showed, in the developed image, the faint but unmistakable outline of a third figure. It was not a person. It was not a shadow. It appeared to be a silhouette of a shape that Dr. Ashgrove, in his testimony, described as resembling the branching structure of a nerve cell magnified to the height of a man. A dark, branching form, like a dendritic tree, like a diagram from an anatomy textbook that had not yet been written, standing directly behind the children. No one in that room had seen it with their naked eyes. Only the camera saw it. Immediately after the exposure, both twins stood up from the bench at the same moment. They turned to face the white sheet. They stood motionless for approximately 10 seconds. Then Clara spoke. She said, in a voice that Father Crane described as sounding like 2 voices layered on top of one another, slightly out of phase, "It has finished counting." Dr. Ashgrove asked, "What has finished counting?" Clara did not answer. Eleanor did. She said, "Us." 4 hours later, the Caldwell twins were gone. They were last seen at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, walking together along the path that led from the farmhouse toward the eastern edge of the marsh. Mrs. Caldwell watched them from the kitchen window. She said they were holding hands. She said they were walking in perfect step, left foot, right foot, left foot, as though they were a single organism with 4 legs. She looked away for a moment to tend the fire. When she looked back, the path was empty. A search was organized within the hour. Every able-bodied person in Harrowden Marsh participated. They searched for 9 days. They dragged the ponds. They probed the bogs with poles. They brought dogs from Woodbridge, who followed a scent to a point approximately 200 yards east of the farmhouse, and then stopped. All 3 dogs stopped at the same point. They would not go further. They sat down, whined, and refused to move. The spot where the dogs stopped was an unremarkable patch of marshy ground. There were no footprints beyond that point. There was no disturbance in the soil or vegetation. It was as though Eleanor and Clara Caldwell had simply ceased to exist at that precise location. No bodies were ever found. The magistrate's inquest, conducted in October of 1858, recorded a verdict of death by misadventure, presumed drowning. This was the standard verdict for missing persons in marshland areas. It satisfied the legal requirement. It explained nothing. Dr. Fenwick's casebook was collected by representatives of the Royal College of Physicians. Dr. Ashgrove's testimony was sealed by order of the magistrate and was not to be opened for 100 years. When the seal was broken in 1958, the envelope was found to contain 14 pages of testimony and one additional item that had not been listed in the original inventory: a single sheet of paper, covered on both sides with a dense, repeating pattern of symbols that no one has been able to identify. The handwriting does not match Ashgrove's. It does not match Fenwick's. A graphological analysis conducted in 1974 concluded that the writing appeared to have been produced by two hands simultaneously, one forming the upper half of each symbol, the other forming the lower half in perfect coordination. The Caldwell farmhouse burned to the ground in 1861. The cause was never determined. Thomas and Anne Caldwell had already left Harrowden Marsh by then. They moved to Ipswich, where Thomas worked as